Hello and welcome to another episode of Trident Talks. In this series, I'll be speaking to early stage founders of early stage cybersecurity startups, understanding the interesting technology that they're coming into the market with, and understanding the market they're addressing and how they're looking to address it. Today, I am joined by Clutch Security CEO and co-founder Ofir. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Great to have you. So in this episode, kind of really keen to understand Clutch Security, understand the identity space, but kind of starting off trying to understand your background. So for those who don't know, kind of what is your background and kind of where did the inspiration come from to start Clutch Security?
Mm-hmm. So I started my career working at one of the biggest VARs in Israel, and this role was actually pretty pivotal for me because it allowed me to understand which technologies and products really work with high efficacy with customers and which didn't. It also allowed me to understand how the big vendors out there work, how they operate, from everything how to work with channel partners to even myself working with sales representatives of those vendors in the field. So a lot of hands-on experience in that first role, being exposed to a lot of different technologies from IT and security. Fast forward a few years, that's when I moved to a role where I was doing incident response and consulting for about 4.5 years, mostly working with Fortune 500 companies, by the way. And so I would say that this role was also pretty much a major point in my career in the sense that I was working with teams on the ground, being in the trenches and fending off attackers, everything from nation-state threat actors to cybercrime groups and financially motivated ones. So moving from the VAR experience when it was just core hands-on work on technologies to then being in the trenches, seeing those technologies that I knew from before, which ones failed in preventing attacks from happening and which ones didn't. And fast forward from that role, I actually moved to a company called Hunters, which is a next-gen SIM, where I ultimately became the COO. And so I had the chance to collaborate very, very closely with all of our customers and seeing the growth of the company. And from that, my next step was actually at Clutch, which is where I am today.
Okay, amazing. So really from your point of view, it's seeing the issues with lots of security from a first-hand point of view, being, like you say, being there in the trenches, seeing it from a first-hand, understanding, the pros and then the cons of it as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
When I look back at my career, I often like to say that my first time encountering those non-human identities, those things that we solve for at Clutch, I actually encountered them literally on day one in that first role at that VAR, because what I was doing is planning, deploying, and maintaining everything from Active Directory to routers, switches, load balancers, firewalls, DLPs, SIMs, proxy gateways, email gateways, and every type of technology where I had to come and integrate it into the environment of the customer. That technology required some kind of a privileged identity to be able to do what it needed to do. And those identities, most often, they would be just service accounts in Active Directory, were almost needed to be privileged. And those would later become a subset of an HIs. And so whenever I would be on the trenches working with customers, and I would ask for that type of identity, a privileged identity, they would say one of two answers. One was, no way, we're giving you domain admin. That's the account with the highest privileges. Let's work with a vendor to understand what privileges you really need. And the other type would say, oh yes, we have one privileged domain admin account. We give it to all vendors. Here's your credentials. Do your thing. And that got me scratching my head a bit and thinking to myself, that's going to become a major problem one day. And then fast forward to actually that role doing incident response, I can say that almost every breach I was a part of and investigated and remediated, there was some sort of non-human identity being a component of that incident. And the second that the attackers got to that identity, to that service account, that API key, that secret, that was the tipping point of the breach. That's where things got detrimental for the organization. And so I really got to see that there aren't just management perspectives for those identities, but also actual security challenges. And then moving to Hunters, where I was the COO, that's where a very notable breach happened of a company called Circle CI. I saw how teams with lean and engineering teams took a lot of time to actually remediate that breach. And I thought to myself, if this thing takes so long for small teams, what would it take for the bigger enterprises out there? And then we went outside the building, me and my two co-founders met with a lot of very big companies, and we heard that that's a very big problem. So that's kind of what sparked us to start Clutch.
Okay, amazing. So when you talk about non-human identities, I suppose for a lot of people, it can kind of come across as a bit of a new space. Obviously we've got human identities, but it's been around for a while. Yeah. How would you kind of describe a non-human identity?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand about non-human identities is first just what the identity fabric looks like today in the enterprise. And when we look at the identity fabric in the enterprise today, we'll see that there's actually two types of identities: human identities and non-human identities. Now, human identities are the ones that we know and love, right? It's our employees, our contractors, our third-party vendors. Well, they're always going to be managed centrally with things like Okta or Azure AD or Active Directory. Most of the time, they're also going to be pretty much low volume in the sense that you're not going to find a company with 10 million human identities. These things don't really exist, pretty much capped at a certain number. And then when we look at the privileges those human identities have, if you put aside for a second IT admins and DevOps engineers, the majority of the employees are pretty much confined with what they can do, and they're limited on privileges. Then when we look at the security controls that they have, we have things like multi-factor authentication, conditional access policies, etc. So that's the human identity. That's kind of very well known, not yet solved, I would say, but it's not solved because some tools or technologies are missing. I would say it's not solved yet because of lack of integration of existing tools. So there's the other type of identity that I mentioned. That's the non-human identities. That's the more challenging one. And we need to start with just the definition. What is non-human identities? And the way we look at it is basically an umbrella term that consists of things like API keys, like secrets, like tokens, like service accounts, like certificates. Put simply, any type of machine identity that performs programmatic operations without any human intervention. This is what it means to us. And when we look at those identities, there's a stark contrast against human identities, because those non-human identities are just fragmented across the enterprise because they're in cloud, in SaaS, in on-prem environments. There isn't any Okta for these things. You can't provision them and deprovision them centrally. You need to go to the end system and do it there. When you look at the sheer volume, the record to date we saw with one of our customers is 50-1, as in 50 non-human identities per one human identity. Now start to think about the bigger enterprises out there. Your average company of the 4,500 with maybe 40,000 employees. How many NHIs, non-human identities, are they going to have, and where? Just fragmented all over. When you look at privileges, these are privileged by design because they keep the lights on in production, they power up our corporate systems, and of course, security control-wise, well, there isn't any MFA for those things because they need to work seamlessly, right? And so that's the very big difference between human identities and non-human identities. The way I like to look at it sometimes is there's the famous iceberg picture where you only see the tip of the iceberg, but then there's the mass of it below the surface. That's how I look at the landscape of identity. The human identities that we know we see them, we interact with them, but we don't notice the ones that are just doing all the work behind the scenes.
So, and where do you see that going in terms of, let's say 1 or 2 years from now? I know you mentioned there's 50-1. Do you see that ratio increasing, or do you think with the use of like Clutch security, you can start to have a better hold over those non-human identities?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think it's going to get worse before it gets a lot better. I think the trends that we're seeing is more and more technologies coming out every day in cloud, in SaaS, and enterprises are adopting technologies at a pace higher than the security is able to actually cope with and understand. And so we're seeing this influx of NHIs, of non-human identities, just all over the enterprise. And so that's what I mean when I say it's going to get worse, because you now are going to have things like AI agents, right? Things that are going to just exponentially increase this number of identities. But we do see a light at the end of the tunnel, because we're seeing a shift. And this shift in those identities is where we're guiding our customers towards. There's a concept we like to call being secretless. Secretless is actually saying, what if we can achieve the same thing that this non-human identity is doing, but without needing to manage an identity, right? Those non-human identities we mentioned, those API keys, those secrets, those service accounts, they're static and they're long-lived. They're there, and unless you change them, they stay the same, which is a huge risk. And so we're actually advocating and helping our customers transition to being secretless, to being ephemeral, as in instead of using those static and long-lived keys, helping them to migrate and use short-lived and ephemeral keys and tokens, which actually don't require any management to begin with.
Okay, and that's the zero trust kind of aspect of the platform itself that you're identifying there.
I would say that the zero trust is the ability to actually take the same zero trust approach you're applying to your human identities. Never trust, always verify, least privilege, right? Context aware access, and applying that same thing to those non human identities, right? And as you're putting those controls in place of zero trust, you're able to, on day one, have Clutch help you to protect yourself against risks while being in the journey towards being ephemeral and not needing to have those NHIs to begin with.
Okay, and you touch on context of an NHI and how that kind of comes into play. What is it that Clutch does to give that context in terms of what they look like?
Yeah, so I think one special thing that we do is we actually transcend beyond the identity itself. An important thing to understand today is, like I mentioned before, those identities are in the cloud, in SaaS, in on-prem, in CI/CD, in code, in vaults, in data warehouses. And the thing is, they're not confined to a specific terrain, because today SaaS is speaking to cloud, speaking to CI/CD, speaking to vault. So it's a fully interconnected ecosystem, which makes the challenge of knowing what you have a lot bigger. And so what we do is we actually came up with a concept we call identity lineage. An identity lineage is a concept that says that every non-human identity that you have, doesn't matter if it's a service account in Active Directory, or an API key of a SaaS application, or a secret used by a workload in the cloud, doesn't matter what it is, it's always going to live in an ecosystem that consists of 5 elements. There's always going to be an origin. That's the source of truth where the identity is provisioned in. There's always going to be people. That's the attribution to the workforce. Think about the employees who created the secret, had access to it, used it, etc. Then there's storage. Those are the storage places where we're storing those keys and secrets. Think about Vault and secret managers. Think about password manager like 1Password or LastPass, and even things being hard-coded in code. That's storage. Consumers are those systems using those identities programmatically to perform operations. And lastly, resources, that's just the things I'll be able to access and what I'll be able to do on those resources once I retain access to this identity. And so the big thing here is not looking just at the identity itself, looking at the entire ecosystem in which it's operating to get a better sense of the context and of what this identity is doing, and basically everything around it.
Yeah. Okay. And very much that for you now is where you're up to now in terms of the business. I mean, where do you see, I suppose, not only Clutch but the identity space moving in the next let's say 1 or 2 years?
Yeah, I think in the next 1 or 2 years, we'll start to see an awareness increase in the understanding of the ephemeral concept and the secret list, what I mentioned before. That's going to be key, and we see companies right now starting to understand that this is where they need to move. It's a slow shift. It's gradual, and we're going to get there. That's the 1 or 2 years from now. Later on, we'll start to see, I would say, less and less use of those static and long-lived credentials, and the use of alternatives, which are of less management overhead and provide more security. That's where I see kind of the end game for NHIs.
Yeah, and it's as much about awareness in terms of understanding what NHIs are in the network. I know last week you released an NHI index in order to try of tackle the NHI debt that we've got at the moment. Are you able to kind of give a bit of insight in terms of what that index does and how it kind of supports people?
Absolutely. Um, Just like you said, we realized that uh, while the awareness has increased in the community and in the industry, uh, there's still a lot more to go. And we wanted to be able to share with the community our research. And the research that we did is we've actually started with just defining what are NHIs, what are the different types, what's a token, what's a secret, what's a service account, what do these things look like, what do they serve, why do we have them, what risks do they bring in when you use them. That's just the fundamentals. That's level one. Then we actually started to look at the real world, and we looked at all of the major cloud providers out there and CI/CD platforms and version control systems and even lots of SaaS applications. And we actually wanted to show when you're using a given service in a cloud provider, what non-human identities are you actually inheriting and inherently need to use if you use that service. And what we were able to uncover is that there's literally hundreds of different NHIs inherent to those cloud providers that teams have to use if they want to leverage those services. And so what we've done beyond just the mapping itself is we show what audit logs you need to actually log and make sure that you have if you want to see the actions performed by those identities, and what security controls, native security controls, those vendors have in place to make sure that you use those NHIs effectively. And last but not least, we also created a resource for the community called Federator, which allows companies today to, if they have, let's say, Azure and they also have AWS, and they want those two clouds to interconnect. Until today, most teams, the way they did that is by creating NHIs on both cloud providers and using them on the other provider and creating that connectivity, which again is not a best practice. The tool that we released allows companies to create that full mesh federation without the need to have any long-lived static keys, which is big. And from, I would say, an hour from the time we released this open source tool to the community, we've had lots of engagement and collaboration on the tool, and so I think it's been gaining traction.
That's absolutely amazing. Well, look, I really appreciate you taking the time to give some insight in terms of non-human identities and the identity space in general. In terms of the NHI index, we'll link that below for those interested in having a look at it, as well as a link to Clutch Security's website, so you can see how they're looking to tackle the NHI problem. Ofir, thank you very, very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. Same here.